Okay, so for today, what we want to do is look at pivot tables. A pivot table is very simply a summary of filtered data. So what I have here is a list of hockey equipment and sales data. I have about 100 rows of information. Pivot tables are great for large amounts of data. It could be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of rows of data. And again, it's the idea is that you'd like to have a small summary filtered data. So let's understand what that means. So for instance, let's say I wanted to see what the quantity totals for a specific product. So if I filter, let's say just helmets here and hit OK, I have a total of 154 quantity and 8286 total dollar amount. And if I wanted to summarize, let's say another one, and let's say I took off helmet and I went to gloves, I would have this 135 quantity total and then 6,483 in total sales. So let's say I would like that for every product, and I'd like it broken down maybe by month and maybe broken down by size and things like that. So that's what a pivot table does, and it's very easy actually to create. So when you create a pivot table, you want to typically do those on their own separate sheet because the rows and columns are dynamic and they grow and shrink accordingly. Now what I like to do is actually label my data. So I have actually created a label here, a data range called sales table, and that's the entire 100 rows of data here that we're going to use. So to create the pivot table, we're going to click on this pivot sheet, this sheet that I just called pivot, and we're going to start on A1 and we're going to click insert pivot table, and then it asks for a range. And so this is where I type in that range that I created, sales table, and hit enter. And so you're presented with a blank pivot table that you can then add rows and columns and filters. So it's really easy. So let's say we want a product. So we'll click product. It automatically puts it on the rows, and we want to know the total sum of quantity and also the total sum of total dollar amount. So just by clicking those, it fills in this grid on the right, and there's certainly customizations you can do, but that essentially does exactly what we want. It creates a listing, a summary of filtered data. So if we look at that helmet, there's those numbers that we had seen before, and same with gloves. So now let's say we want to do some more work and we want to actually put in like the month. So what month they were actually the sales were in. So just by clicking month, it adds it to the rows, and now we see the months broken down for each product. And if we add the size, it even does it even further, and you can see this gets really long. But that's essentially what a pivot table does. It breaks down all this information and summarizes it. Now, let's say we want to break this down a little differently, and we want the months to go across the top as columns, and we want to just see the total sales dollars. So what we would do is take off quantity, and we would just drag the month field up to columns. And now it's breaking out for each equipment, for each product, for every size, it's breaking it out per month. And that's it. That's basically what a pivot table does, and it's fantastic. And if we adjust information, for instance, if we go into composite stick, we'll look at this very top row. It's 7727. Let's go find a composite stick in the data and just change the quantity here. So let's make it big. We'll make it 20. And so that's going to change that number back on pivot. So now it doesn't change it automatically. You have to right click and hit refresh on pivot tables for it to change the data. But now the data has dynamically changed. So pivot tables are dynamic and they can be fully customizable. So the next thing would be to, like, let's say, stylize this pivot table. So when you click on a pivot table anywhere, there's two new toolbars that show up, the pivot table analyze and the design. So we're going to go ahead and stylize this, and just by clicking on one of them or more of them, you can change the styles. We're going to go down here to dark and just choose this like green one. And then there are things you can do, like for instance banded rows up here, which now puts row bands, different colors of rows for the sizes. And there's a whole host of things you can do. So one thing I like to do is change the heading. So we might want to call this equipment totals, and we might want to call this the month. Okay. The other thing we'd like to do is maybe size these properly. So we'll just highlight all of them and size them so they're the same size. And then if you change the format of a number here, it'll just do that one number. So there's a trick. What you do is you click somewhere in the field and go to Value Field Settings. And then from here you go to Number Format. And we're going to click on Currency and then click OK. And now the whole table is formatted. You'll notice that the size of the columns shrunk again. So that's something we want to change. So you right click on the table and go to Pivot Table Options, and you take off this Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. And so we hit OK. So now let's go ahead and resize these again by highlighting the columns and resizing them. And then if we do a refresh or anything like that, the column widths stay the same. So that's a pretty good little pivot table. It shows all the information we want. And you can have multiple pivot tables. So let's go down here and insert another pivot table. And maybe this one we just want to be, we'll start with the same sales table data. And maybe this one we just want to be the month and the total sales amount. And then there's other things you can do. So you can filter. So if you click on here, you can say, let's say we just want to see the last 3 months. So it'll filter that out. You could also say, let's say we want to filter on product. You can drag that down here into filter, and now you have this other filter. So you could say, let's look at gloves only. And so what that should show you is that gloves was only existed in June. It was for the $1,548, which is right here. And so you can also do multiple filters. You could say select multiple items and choose a few other ones, and that would show you the totals for those 3 items. So again, you can filter and clean those up and stylize them as much as you want. So another great part of pivot tables is there's a way to find out what's behind each of these calculated cells. So let's say I want to know what makes up this 2577 here. All I have to do is just double click and it will bring up a spreadsheet showing just the data that makes up that total. And again, it's just a temporary sheet, so all you have to do is right click and delete it when you're done looking at it. And again, you can do that for any of the calculated cells there. But that's the basics of pivot tables. Hopefully you will be more inclined to try them out. And as always, knowledge is power.